here, put out by the Bristol Radical History Group. As the title suggests, so somebody said it was not a very snappy title, but it's about anarchism in Bristol in the West Country. It's looking at the radical movement, looking at the roots of the radical movement in Bristol. So looking at things like the Romantic period, looking at the Chartists, looking at the Free Thinkers. So those are the movements that came together to form socialism. And then we can think about anarchism proper coming at the end of that. Really can't really talk about anarchism until later in the late 19th century. Anarchism as we all know and love it today. And I came to write this really because I wanted to know myself, so I was interested in myself. I've been interested in the anarchism since probably as a teenager in the 1980s. As a teenager picking up books like Colin Ward's Anarchy in Action. Colin Ward sadly died earlier this year. Something like George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, George Woodcock's History of Anarchism, so I became interested in that stuff quite early. As well as reading magazines like Freedom and Green Line when I could get hold of them in the West Country, from the rural part of the West Country that I was from anyway. Probably in keeping with a lot of old timers, I was also interested in anarcho-punk that came along at the time, so bands like Crass and the Poison Girls, Flux Pink Indians, Culture Shock here in the West Country. Also in the 1980s at that time there was a whole resurgence, in some ways probably a top moment for the counterculture in terms of had things like the miners' strike going on at that time, the end of the Free Festival, so the last Stonehenge Free Festival that took place in 1984, very big anti-war movement. As we move into the 90s there was hunt sabbing, animal liberation. There was the road protest movement, which was really big in the West Country, Salisbury Hill. So those are the sorts of things that sort of I became interested in anarchism. It was around at the time. I suppose one point for us as radical historians is all this stuff already, it's kind of 20 or 30 years ago and it's already going into history, so there's a huge amount of information there, a lot of research to be done if anybody's interested. The other thing you'll notice about the title is that it says to 1950, and I very deliberately shied away from looking up to the present day, but if anybody's got any ideas for what we could put in the rest, or in a sequel, might be able to think about that afterwards. Might not have too much time for questions today, though, apparently. So looking back a bit further, perhaps we can think about, well, was there an anarchist tradition and movement? I think there's certainly a tradition. Whether there's a movement might be a different question. Certainly there's a tradition. Maybe the fact that we're all here today at the 3rd Bristol Anarchist Book Fair. So there's one in 2008 in St Werburgh's. There was one down in the Bridewell last year. This is the 3rd one. Maybe another little instance of the way of how fragile history is, because when we did one in 2008, we all said, oh, this is the first anarchist book fair that's happened in Bristol for 15 years. Never met anybody that went to this sort of mythological anarchist book fair. Has anybody here been to any of these very old anarchist book fairs? No. So maybe they never happened, or maybe it's one of those things, if it happened and you remember it and you just weren't there.
Very dodgy.
Yeah.
On set and outside.
So anyway, I didn't completely come up with this out of the blue. I had a few ideas where to start. I was quite interested in a character called Edward Carpenter, who I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. I was reading Sheila Rowbotham, who you may have come across, socialist feminist, wrote quite a chunky biography of Edward Carpenter recently. And next there's a lot of references to Bristol in there, so I was thinking, there was quite a big socialist movement, quite a radical movement in Bristol at the time, so there's a few tips there. There was one or two other tips I pulled together. But I also came across quite a few people that I'd certainly never heard of before. So I really enjoyed the process of kind of discovering these people, so hopefully I can introduce a few of them to you in a moment. And they're all completely forgotten by probably anybody who's not an anarchist anorak. So I grew in confidence that there was a story here. There's not that much written about English anarchism anyway, and it tends to be far more kind of sexy, big impact places like the Spanish Revolution than little old Bristol or even England. There was a book called Slow Burning Fuse by somebody called John Quayle, who wrote a history of British anarchism, but it was about 30 years ago, long out of print. So there's not very much around today. So first of all, I started off for talking about anarchism before anarchism. So really don't talk about anarchy in a positive sense until the 1840s when Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, property is theft, you may have heard of, is his famous slogan from the 1840s. He started talking about anarchy as a positive movement, and he came up with a slogan, anarchy is order. So when you see the anarchy symbol today, the A with the ring round, that's a graphic depiction of anarchy is order. So that was a 1960s French group came up with that symbol. It's kind of on every wall throughout the world today. And I start off really in terms of looking at the history of anarchism with this character here, Edmund Burke, you might see down on the, you might recognise from the centre of town. And as I put on the back, there's a quite a bold claim that he wrote the first anarchist tract, something called Vindication of Natural Society, a view of the miseries and evils arising to mankind, published in 1756. And he made a sort of proto-anarchist argument in this tract that it was the move from natural society to political society that everything went horribly wrong. It was characterised by states and governments, political society, and then they're divided into hostile factions within that. We've got a class system. And he writes, "Let us take a review," he urges, "of the dungeons, the whips, chains, racks, gibbets with which every society is abundantly stored, by which hundreds of victims are annually offered up to support a dozen or two in pride, and madness and millions in abject servitude." Now, there's two problems with this that I'm going to have to concede. First of all, Edmund Burke was born in Dublin, and this was written 20 years before he came to Bristol and became the Bristol MP. But I think we can probably get away with him being a Bristolian because he's there in the centre of the town, waving down in the Broad Quay. The problem with him being an anarchist is also slightly difficult because it's almost certainly written as a satire, and the whole idea about writing this tract was an idea about demonstrating the effect of taking an argument to ridiculous extremes. Can we have the next William Godwin, please? William Godwin. Now, if that was his intention, it backfired very badly because William Godwin read this tract and he actually thought, started writing a political account called Inquiry into Political Justice. That's really the first detailed economic theoretical account of anarchism in the tradition, in the positive sense that we think about it today. And he was slightly inspired by reading Burke's book. Again, William Godwin didn't spend very much time in the West Country, but he came here to visit Percy Bysshe Shelley, who was actually out at the time. He was also a big sadly for him. Yeah. He was also a big inspiration on Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Robert Southey, or Southey, as some people say. He's supposed to be called Southey because Byron rhymed him with mouthy, apparently. But so they were in their early days, before they became quite reactionary. They were political radicals living in Bristol, very much influenced by Godwin's ideas. So they were sort of in the Romantic period. They were influential, and Coleridge gave lectures on Godwin's idea in the Corn Market, and I think they had to move them because they were so well attended, and in the College Green. So he was friends with Percy Bysshe Shelley as well. His daughter eloped with Shelley, Mary Shelley, wrote Frankenstein as an 18-year-old and launched the genre of science fiction, so claim to fame. Also married Mary Wollstonecraft, who spent quite a lot of time living in Bristol. Mary Wollstonecraft, The Vindication of the Rights of Women, which is seen as one of the first important feminist texts. So there are a lot of connections with Godwin in the West Country. There's a lot of pictures of Godwin as well. The reason I picked this one is it's partly interesting because it refers to the treason trials of 1794. So there were, I think there were 6 members of the London Corresponding Society whose lives were on the line for treason in the aftermath of the French Revolution. There's Thomas Holcroft, who's the novelist there on the left, wrote Hugh Trevor and Anne of St Cleves. Godwin himself was a novelist. There was John Thelwall, who's still kind of known to a certain extent. Thomas Hardy, not the novelist, the member of the London Corresponding Society. Horntuck. So all these people, their lives were on the line. Godwin wrote something called Cursory Strictures, which is generally seen as the tract that got them acquitted in that case. So the other interesting thing about this picture is it was a cork sketch done by Sir Thomas Lawrence, which again gives us a West Country connection, because Lawrence was born in Bristol. He was the son of the innkeeper of the Bear Hotel in Devizes, and he spent quite a lot of time in Bath, so there's a West Country connection there. Shall we move on, please? So, Edward Carpenter. So I'm going to jump a lot of the 19th century and the radical stuff, the early 19th century stuff, and we'll move on to Edward Carpenter. So this is him. I like this picture because it's done by Roger Fry, one of the Bloomsbury set. And he wrote in a letter describing this picture that it was a picture of Edward Carpenter done in 1894 in a very anarchist coat. So Edward Carpenter was from Sheffield, but he's absolutely central to this whole story about Bristol anarchism. And think about anarchism. I said it wasn't really talked about until the 1840s, created in the 1840s with Proudhon. It wasn't really till the 1880s that anarchism arises as a particular strand of socialism. And Carpenter was very much involved with that. So if you're talking about the 1880s, there were three real strands of socialism. There was the Socialist League, which is associated with William Morris, libertarian socialist, not really an anarchist, but certainly a libertarian on good terms with Carpenter. There was the Fabian Society, which I think has already been mentioned once today, but was now it's a part of the sort of soft left of the Labour Party, but it had its origins in the same period. But it was fairly kind of broad church in its early days until I think anarchists were asked to leave in 1886, so there was a rift there. There was also the Marxist scientific type socialism of the Social Democratic Federation. Somebody called H.M. Hindman, you may have come across, was behind that group. But within a local group like the Bristol Socialist Society, you'd get all these different strands of socialism would work together. They wouldn't be mutually antagonistic. There'd be kind of be a model for unity and diversity, if you like. And so somebody like Edward Carpenter would be involved with all three groups, and he'd hobnob in these overlapping circles. So there was no, either would be quite critical of somebody, he'd have his own angle and he wouldn't kind of paper over any disputes within them, but he would kind of work with all the groups. So he came down from Sheffield. He's known sometimes, he's a very influential and progressive figure. He's known as the kind of the archetypal crank. So George Orwell, for example, called him a sandals wearer and a banana eater. And he says, there's a quote from George Orwell, I think this is in The Road to Wigan Pier. One sometimes gets the impression that the very words socialism and communism draw towards them with magnetic force every fruit juice drinker, nudist, sandal wearer, sex maniac, Quaker, nature cure quack, pacifist, and feminist in England. Well, he wasn't a Quaker or a pacifist, but I think 7 out of 9 is not bad. In any case, we might remember that E.F. Schumacher, who wrote The Small is Beautiful, reclaimed the honour of cranks by saying that they're tiny devices that create gigantic revolutions. So Carpenter himself, he formed a version of socialism that was based on workers' control rather than nationalisation. So immediately you can tell he's somebody kind of leaning in an anarchist type direction. He favoured a free communal society as the finest socialist objective. He was also a contributor to Freedom magazine, which was started up by Peter Kropotkin and Charlotte Wilson in the 1886, and is on sale here today. It's still very much going, Freedom magazine. He met two Bristolians called John Charland and Robert Charland, who helped to found the Bristol Socialist Society in 1885. I think that was his first kind of link into the Bristol Circle. And then after that, he came down right the way through from the 1880s, I think right until well into the 20th century. Probably he died in 1829. He was still kind of involved with the Bristol Circle, so he would kind of hop between London, the North, Bristol. So he had a real pivotal role in the radical movement at that time. And I think probably these debates about socialism and anarchism were one of the things that kind of sustained his friendship with Charland's all through that time. And there's a quote from the obituary of Edward Carpenter in 1829, written by his friend Robert Charland, and it says, it's been suggested that Carpenter was not a social democrat, and in a sense that is correct. His teaching savoured more of anarchist communism, and that is akin to the ideal of many of us. He always took a keen and helping interest in all phases of the socialist and labour movement. Realising the success of these political and industrial efforts was an essential step to the higher state he ever visualised. So he had increasingly strong links with the socialist circles down here, as I've mentioned. He knew people like there were anarchist groups in Warsaw. There were also the Sheffield anarchists, but it was the Warsaw anarchists he was involved with going up. They had legal proceedings against them. He was involved in going up to Warsaw. He spoke in their defence and spoke about himself as being an anarchist, so he's a self-described anarchist. And he also got an old friend from the Bristol Socialist Society, a chap called Hugh Holmes Gore, to present their legal defence. And he visited Bristol on a regular basis. He never asked any fees. He was really kind of warmly appreciated by the Bristolians, and he was described. This is an absolute key book for radicalism in Bristol. Actually, if you can get sight of it, there's a book called the Account of the Socialist and Labour and Socialist Movement in Bristol. It's a 1929 book by Sampson Breyer, which is a fascinating account of the political milieu of that time. And he said that of Carpenter, that the environment that shaped his addresses provided the environment that shaped the intellectual and ethical outlook of the earliest Bristol socialists. So as well as the Charland family, Edward Carpenter also knew people like Ben Tillett, who was a local boy made good. He was the local Dockers leader who eventually became the national Dockers leader, so he's quite an important character in terms of political labour history. Enid Stacey, another Bristolian, and also Gertrude Dix, who's a novelist of some mystery who I'll mention briefly a bit later, who was a Bristolian as well. He also knew William Morris through their mutual involvement through the Socialist League and the Social Democratic Federation. William Morris himself came down to Bristol and spoke for the Bristol Socialist Society, I suspect probably through connections with Carpenter again. Morris gave a talk on art and labour in the lecture theatre in Bristol City Museum in 1885, outlining a creed that characteristically combined social justice, aesthetics and human happiness. He spoke for the working class's need to enjoy a pleasant house in a pleasant place, education and leisure in a socialist society. His definition of a socialist society is that of a universal cooperation in place of competition or universal war, looking forward to a time when the words rich and poor that have so long cursed the world will have no meaning, when we shall all be friends and good fellows united in the community of happy, reasonable, honoured labour, which alone can produce genuine art or the pleasure of life. Can we have the next? We've got Kropotkin now. I think we might need to skip that one, which is a bit. There's Kropotkin. I could only find a copy of one of his books. I'll scan that from, obviously. Yeah, again, it was probably through the connections with Carpenter that they managed to get Peter Kropotkin down to speak in Bristol. Peter Kropotkin is probably the most famous of the Victorian anarchists. I say he was the editor behind Freedom magazine. He's probably one of the most famous anarchists today, historically as well. So Kropotkin came down and spoke in 1889. I haven't been able to find out exactly what Kropotkin talked about, but he spoke at the St James's Hall in Cumberland Street. Cumberland Street is actually a few streets away from here. I don't think St James's Hall seems to be there anymore, but it's just off Portland Square. And he gave a heavy schedule of lectures across the country that year, and also came down to Bristol the following year, I believe. But we do know that he took an interest in West Country events, because in his book, again, one of probably his most famous books, Mutual Aid, he cited fraternal generosity in Somerset as one of the examples of solidarity. Gave the example of solidarity between workers in a strike situation. And the example he gives, the precise example, is the Radstock miners. Millsy like this one if he was here. Favoured with large kitchen gardens, invited 400 Bristol miners to take their share of cabbages and potatoes. And I think one of the things that's also interesting about this is the Bristol Socialist Society. There's a Bristol Sunday Society that gave talks on a regular basis. And they were getting audiences of around up to 1,700 people along, so really big audiences of working people down in the Old Market area at that time. And they were still, that was in the 1890s, they were still going in the 1920s, and I think they seem to have, 1920s not a good time for revolution and anarchism, so I think they might have sort of petered off there. Can we have Helena Bourne, please? Okay, Helena Bourne and Miriam Daniel were two people I hadn't really come across before until I started reading around, and they featured quite highly in this account of the socialist and labour movement in Bristol. They eventually became anarchists. They were fairly well to do. They lived in Clifton. They moved from Clifton into they were in the Women's Liberal Society. They dropped the Liberal Society and moved into the socialist circles. They left Clifton and moved into St Philip's so that they could show solidarity with the workers in St Philip's as they became more and more radicalised. They became quite prominent within the Socialist Society in the 1880s, and they threw themselves into the cause. They supported striking dockers. They took up honorary offices in the gas workers and general labourers movement. They agitated for improvements in the conditions of home-working seamstresses who weren't politically organised, so that was quite a difficult thing to organise at that time. And then as we move sort of into the late, in 1889, we've got what's called the Bristol Labour Revolt, which is definitely going to be a topic for somebody to look at in a radical history pamphlet, I should think. There's a whole wave of labour revolts across the city at the time, which they were involved with.
What year was that?
1889. Yeah, but it seems
same as the London Dock strike then, isn't it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I mean, some of the London people like Tillett came back. Tom Mann came back, Will Thorne, they all came back to Bristol actually to support the Bristol Dockers as well. Yeah, so that was the same time. So the house that Helena Bourne and Miriam Daniel lived in, 9 Louisa Street. Again, Louisa Street's there, but there's no sign of it. There's a timber yard there and a few cobbles, and it's down by down towards Temple Meads. But that's still there. Yeah. Anyway, they were very involved with the radical movement sort of during the industrial disputes, but they actually moved away to Boston, Massachusetts, where they were still involved. They sort of moved towards anarchism. I think they were involved with Benjamin Tucker's magazine Liberty, and they taught themselves typesetting in the offices and carried on working there when they moved over. They seem to have lived in some sort of utopian community over there. Miriam Daniels died sooner. Helena Bourne says, yeah, died 1901. Her biographer, who I think was probably her granddaughter actually, Helen Tufts, writes, to the end of her life, Helena accepted the name of socialist, taking the term in its widest sense. But socialism, as it worked through customary channels, had less and less of her sympathy. In after years, she grew into the principles of philosophical anarchism. Carpenter and Bourne and Daniel also knew Gertrude Dix, who I've mentioned earlier. We don't know very much about her. She was a Bristolian novelist. In 1900, she wrote a novel called The Image Breakers, which is actually partly a satire and exploration of the socialist and anarchist movement in a city called Berminster, which seems very, very, very likely to be Bristol. From it's got docks. We know she came from Bristol and she was involved with the labour movement here, so it's almost certain to be based on Bristol, so that's quite an interesting little insight. There's also, I did manage to get hold of a copy, and there's a scene describing a strike at Sampson's Sweet Factory, and there was a big strike in the 1892. They were called the Sweet Girls because they worked in the sweet factory. Sanders Sweet Factory in Redcliffe, so Sampson's Sweet Factory, Sanders sounds close enough to be a clue there, I think. So that's Helena Bourne and Miriam Daniel. On to Next one. Edward Carpenter talked quite a lot about, we've looked at industrial struggle and the education through these public lectures that were very important at the time. He also talks about what he calls the larger socialism, so it might be something that we're involved with now actually, this idea that there was a much bigger set of issues and a whole kind of cultural scene that was part of socialism at the time. And they talk about pleasure and propaganda, this kind of two-pronged offensive. And this might be about music and literature and art. I think sort of added the sound and the texture and the colour to the movement we're looking at, as well as the bread and butter issues of industrial struggle. So they came up with the first, in English, they wrote the first book of radical songs, and socialist songs came from Bristol. Was involved with the Charlins again, who were a musical family, and with Edward Carpenter, who wrote songs and was a musician, seems to have done absolutely everything. So this is one of the covers. I think Annie Cannon, which you can't probably see the name on there, seems to have been a Bristolian artist as well. This was actually reviewed by Oscar Wilde, and he reviewed, actually there were two, there was one called The Chance of Labour, in an article called The Poetical Socialists. And I'll just quote Wilde's review, one line. He says, "It's evident from Mr. Carpenter's book that should the revolution ever break out in England, we shall have no inarticulate roar, but rather pleasant glees and graceful part songs." So that's change from thrash punk. Can we have the cycling club, please? That's the next one. This is Walter Crane's work, who's, I believe there's pictures of his connection with Bristol. There's pictures of his up in the West of England Academy of Arts. There's some pictures that were done by William Crane. But I brought this in because this was a part of the Clarion. And so if we're talking about the culture of socialism in the 1880s and 1890s, the Clarion magazine was started in the 1890s, and it was a really important, not only was it a magazine, but there was a whole kind of movement behind it, cultural movement behind it, which was involved cycling, it involved rambling clubs, drama clubs, handicraft clubs. There were various kind of youth wings of socialism as well, which were involved with this. And the whole idea behind the Clarion really was to promote socialism by being social. So they would organise lots of convivial jollies, and people would go along and enjoy themselves. Therefore, it was kind of a secular equivalent, maybe a lot of the sort of church groups that were around at the time. Probably one of the biggest parts of this was the Clarion Cycling Club. I was amazed to find out that the Clarion Cycling Club is still going today, and there isn't a Bristol branch anymore, but there is one down in Dorset, so there's still a West Country connection there. But they've still been going since though. So the Clarion magazine long since finished, I think, in the interwar period, but the cycling club is still at it, and they've still, they still use this logo with socialism is the hope of the world and fellowship is life on there.
There's a Clarion in the first D.
Oh, is there? Oh, okay, right. Oh, excellent, right, yeah. So they're still very much out there. And what the Clarion did, in some ways it's a forerunner of the Labour Party. It was actually formed before the Independent Labour Party, and they were quite careful about not getting involved in the political discussions between the Social Democratic Federation and the Socialist League and all the various factions. The idea was, again, sort of a unity and diversity. And their objectives, well, certainly in 1919, they set out their objectives as mutual aid, good fellowship, and the propagation of socialism as advocated by the Clarion. So there's a nod to William Morris there, and Kropotkin. So they're still coming out of the libertarian tradition that I'm tracing here.
I think the point of view Holmes Gore was involved in the Bristol cycle group.
Oh, okay. It might well have been, yeah, because it was a very big movement in Bristol. When I say it's not here, well, it looks like it's still in the Dorset and the Forest of Dean, but there isn't present now. But it was Bristol was quite a strong group, and they had Clarion vans which would travel around and sort of they'd give talks and disseminate information. And one of these was actually there was a women's Clarion van which set off from Bristol and got as far as Thornbury, and it was attacked by the police, and there were a lot of arrests, and there was they could be quite controversial, the the arrival of the Clarion van. Just to give a quote and another flavour of the sorts of cultural activities that were going on with the cycling club, and this is a bit like, this is the Clarionettes, as they called themselves, all going off. This is a quote from the Briar's book about the Socialist and Labour movement, I should say, in Bristol. It sounds a bit like a bigger version of today's critical mass bike ride, really. It said that frequently 100 or more members and friends with their wives and children attended. Miles of country lanes and fields were traversed, tea being partaken of at a pre-arranged beauty spot, after which games were participated in. There was never a jaunt without a paste pot and a brush handy with which to affix socialist mottos and text to gateposts, styles and the like. It was the practice of the BSS, Bristol Socialist Society, at the time, to quote such lines as, "The paradise of the rich is the hell of the poor. Socialism means peace, competition means war," on all its posters and handbills, and these were cut off for the purpose. Vandalism, perhaps, but the object was to save human bodies and minds that were being sacrificed daily to the gods of mammon and capitalism. If we move on to, maybe I better speed up a bit actually. How long have I got? Yeah, I mean another one. This is another interesting thing, that this is still the White Way colony at Stroud, which you might well have heard of, set up in the 1890s, and it's still there today, which again is interesting. It was set up on Tolstoyan principles. Early members of the colony, Elmer Maud and Louise Maud, were friends of the novelist and Christian anarchist Leo Tolstoy and translators of his work. So they burned the deeds of the land when they set it up, and I think they made various kind of, the principles kind of changed over the years, but basically it's still there to this day. In the 19s, we're moving forward a little bit now. In the interwar period, 1928 to 1932, Tom Keel was one of the editors of Freedom at the time. So the 1920s weren't really a good time for the anarchist movement. So Freedom magazine sort of finished, but there was a newsletter version of it which was produced, and I think he produced about 15 editions from the White Way colony. And also his partner Lillian Wolfe was involved, who was very much involved with Freedom as well at that time. And she was also involved with the Sunshine Stores, which again, if you know Stroud, the Sunshine Stores was the health food outlet of the White Way colony, and it's still right in the centre of Stroud today. And sometimes Dennis Gould has his stall with anarchist leaflets and pamphlets outside of in that very spot, which is a nice little ongoing connection. And yeah, Lillian Wolfe spent a lot of time there during the interwar period, and then she moved from Stroud back to London, and she carried on working with Freedom magazine, editing it to the end of her life in the 1940s. Okay, next on the list is George Barrett. I hadn't come across George Barrett before, but he was, and I've only got a small picture because I had to lift that one off the Libcom site. He was another member of the Bristol Socialist Society at the beginning of the 20th century. And I think he kind of cut his teeth on lecturing in Bristol and giving talks and writing pamphlets here. I think he fell out with the Bristol Socialist Society. He said that he had difference of opinions brought about by his anarchist politics, which was supposed to have disturbed the group's otherwise peaceful routine. So he moved away from Bristol, but he became quite a major speaker in anarchist circles, and he spoke in to thousands in Glasgow and London. He edited a magazine called, originally enough, The Anarchist. But he seems to have retained...
Next speaker is here.
Ah, okay. Right, okay. He seems to have retained his connections with Bristol. And he wrote a pamphlet called The Last War, which was actually published by a Bristol branch of the anarcho-communist group, anarcho-communist group called the Workers' Freedom Group, which is based down at 19 the Haymarket in Bristol. And he spoke in Bristol in 1913, also saying that, quite interesting, that he thought that the anarchist groups of Bristol and South Wales were the most active of all, perhaps. So even though he's largely forgotten today, this pamphlet, The Last War, apparently sold 10,000 copies in 1913, which is quite a and then it was banned, so that's the reason it stopped selling then. Oh, I'm hoping to, yeah. So if you think about something like the biggest issues of class war sold about 10,000 kind of in its heyday. So, you know, in terms of today's anarchist movement, that's quite a good output. And I think some of his attacks upon capitalist society would equally hold true today. Just to give you a little flavour of something from one of his pamphlets called The Anarchist Revolution. He says, millions are on the verge of starvation. Hundreds of thousands are spending their lives and producing instruments for the destruction of human life. And millions are wasting their existence in a dull tragedy of monotony. If we move further into the next one, have to mention Emma Goldman, who you probably will have heard of, famous Russian American anarchist. She stayed in Redland in 1925. It seems from her autobiography that she didn't have a particularly good time over here. She couldn't find anybody to come to her talks, and I think she found the whole thing quite unsuccessful. It was quite dismal, actually. She spoke at the YMCA on labour under the dictatorship in Russia, and also heroic women of the Russian Revolution at the Folk House down on Park Street. But it says that she struggled to cover her expenses, she said. And she wrote in her diary, the fogs and wet remained faithful and wandered through my system at their own sweet will. I was laid up with chills and fever. So in the end she gave up and moved over with some friends down in Nice. But she spent quite a lot of time in England at that time, and she said one of her highlights of visiting England was to visit Edward Carpenter, who by then was in his 80s. And she called him the Great Libertarian, and she was trying to persuade him to write an introduction to her lover, Alexander Berkman's prison letters, which I think he did. She was also good friends with John Cooper Powys, who's a lot of connections with the West Country, Dorset novelist, actually my favourite. Glastonbury Romance is probably my favourite novel. So they were good friends. They referred to each other with respect. Powys called Goldman, of all the Americans of a certain generation, he remembers her name from childhood, one of the great names of history, along with Kropotkin, Bakunin and Tolstoy. A champion of human and individual liberty on moral and spiritual and philosophical lines. She was back in Bristol to support, to agitate in favour of the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War during the 1937, and she gave a speaking tour here with somebody called Edith Manning, who I might get to mention in a minute, and she was speaking in Bristol on behalf of the International Anti-Fascist Solidarity group. All right, we'll just round off the slides now because I think we're running out of time. We have the next one quickly. Just quick show you this one quickly. That's the Freedom Bookshop. That was a stone's throw away from here in Cheltenham Road. So during the war, they briefly moved to Bristol for about 18 months before moving back to Bristol. So it's another nice little Bristol connection. Finally, I'll just say that there was also a Bristol branch of the Freedom Defence Committee. Just have the final, I'll call this the final slide. I thought this was quite a nice Bristol connection again. During the war, the Freedom called itself War Commentary, and three of the editors, Vernon Richards, Philip Sampson, John Hewitson, were imprisoned for allegedly spreading disaffection amongst the armed forces. And there was a danger that Freedom itself would be suppressed. So this group here, the Bristol Freedom Press Defence Committee, was set up and travelled to try and support them. So that's their work in Bristol. And again, we've got Ethel Manning there, who was involved with. She's an Irish anarchist who was speaking in Bristol during the 1930s. Am I being gonged off?
Right, so
yeah. Okay. Right. Anyway, all the rest. Did I?
Sit down. I'll be long. Is everyone in? See you. Yeah. Sorry.
I was there.